thank you for coming to join us. I thought what I could talk about today is India and India's link to Southeast Asia and American interests in India's progress in its Look East policy. And I thought I'd also share some stories and insights from Washington, D.C. with you that pertain to those developments. Washington, as you know, has decided to pivot towards Asia. And this strategy of a pivot towards Asia was announced in response, at least in part, to a narrative that we saw developing in Beijing. China has done extremely well over the last 20 years. We noted that China began a period that we could call the China Charm Offensive at the beginning of the Asian financial crisis that started in 1998 in Thailand. And the financial crisis, as you know, really struck Southeast Asia very hard. The Americans' response to the financial crisis was seen by some in Southeast Asia as a bit antiseptic, not as warm and friendly as our friends in Southeast Asia would have hoped. And at that time, China was able to move into a new phase of its engagement in Southeast Asia. They sent diplomats to the region who were extremely able, who were leading with ideas about listening to what the Southeast Asians needed. For the first time, China began to invest in Southeast Asia through aid, infrastructure projects, and it dropped its ideological approach to the region and really started to pursue a policy of engagement with Southeast Asia. Over 15 years, China became the first and second largest trading partner for most of the ASEAN countries. At the same time, the United States was fighting two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Near the end of 2008, we ran into a financial crisis in the United States. And at this time, U.S. politics was seen as very much divided. Republicans and Democrats fighting over issues, political issues, and not focusing on U.S. national interests. We were concerned at that time that the Chinese would have read American weakness into this narrative. And indeed, we saw that China's actions did indeed interpret weakness in the United States posture. In 2009, the Chinese drew the 9-dash line around the South China Sea. This was in effect China testing its newfound economic power in Southeast Asia to see if it could assert its sovereign interests in the region over its smaller neighbors. We all want to see China prosper and be a great contributor to public goods. We want to see China feel secure and contribute to regional development and growth. But the question that China asked when it drew the 9-dash line around the South China Sea, and when China and Pakistan have tested the northern border of India, these are questions that have not been answered yet. We don't know, Southeast Asia does not know what China wants or what it wants to do. In that context, as that narrative was building, the United States faced the question of how to talk to the world about its decision to draw down its troops in Afghanistan and leave Iraq. And it was in that context that the United States announced a pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia was in part, at least in part, a message to Beijing. And the message was that the United States did not intend to leave Asia. We intended to continue to be a Pacific power. And it was a message also to India and to our friends in Southeast Asia that the United States intended to and was going to take actions to remain a Pacific power. Now, the U.S. strategy looking at the region has broadened, whereas earlier administrations may have been trying to manage China. The Obama administration, when it first came into power, thought that it was possible to test a theory that the president's China advisors thought might work, which was to go to China on his first trip and see if the Chinese might be willing to work together on sort of some called this the G2 phenomenon. India took note of this, by the way, and let Americans know very quickly what they thought about that approach. But I think even more important was the Chinese response. And what the Chinese response was to President Obama's November trip in 2009 was they saw weakness in the American approach. They saw weakness in President Obama trying to reach out and offer to work together. In fact, they saw that trip as an extension of this Beijing narrative that was beginning, that I talked about. U.S. weak financially, divided politically, focused elsewhere outside of Asia, and possibly leaving and drawing down its troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. The White House, when they came back from the Beijing trip, realized that they had made a mistake, and a new strategy was developing in Washington. And this new strategy puts ASEAN at the core of a new emerging regional architecture for finance and trade called the East Asia Summit. This ASEAN-centric approach was designed by Hillary Clinton and with support from her senior staff. And the idea of this approach basically is to create a table, if you will, or a framework whereby we the Americans plus India and the 10 ASEAN countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, can convince China over time to sit at the table with us and make the rules in the neighborhood and play by those rules. But this effort takes will take a collective effort, and we all have to be sitting at the table and be serious about our objectives. And this is where I come to the question of India's policy towards Asia, towards the East. We know that in 1991, India announced a Look East policy. But we at CSIS have embarked on a deep study on ASEAN-India connectivity. It's called Enhancing Indian-ASEAN Connectivity, and we launched this study that was done in connection with ICREER in New Delhi and with the ERIA think tank in Jakarta. And that study basically looked at the foundations of India's engagement in Southeast Asia. Your historical engagement, which by the way is visiting Kochi, is very impressive. I mean, I have to say that I came yesterday and I got right out to the palace. I think the Dutch palace has incredible depictions of the Ramayana on its walls. And as a Southeast Asianist, I was reminded once again of the deep, deep connections that India has to Southeast Asia. India has given Southeast Asia much of its foundation for its religion, its culture, its language, and so India's connections to Southeast Asia are absolutely foundational. They're fundamental. But when we look at India's engagement in the region today, I think, if I can be frank, in the interest of academic pursuits and exploration, we have to say that we wonder when India will fully engage in Southeast Asia. Some of your businesses have begun to obviously do very, very well there. Energy exports or imports from Southeast Asia into India are very significant. Your naval and military engagement has begun to pick up and is actually impressive. I think the Indian Ocean will link the Indian military more closely to the new structures under the East Asia Summit, including the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, which will take place next week in Brunei. But I think Americans want to understand more about the political support within India for engaging East. And that's part of the reason that I'm here. I'm trying to understand whether India's engagement in the East Asia Summit, its engagement with ASEAN, has legs. Does it have political support in India? And I think that would probably come from deep business engagement, people-to-people ties, which are potentially very strong. And we have recommended several things to the Indian and American governments that they can do to strengthen the engagement between India, ASEAN, and the United States. I'll just mention a couple of these, and then I'll stop and open it up to questions and discussions, because this room is filled with people who know an awful lot about India's policy, and I would like to learn from you. But we recommended that to really be effective, the United States has to work with India on its economic and trade strategies. And our economic and trade strategies need to be coordinated with our geostrategic outlook. America's geostrategic outlook, as I mentioned, towards the region right now is sort of a power shot from as if you were above Australia and Indonesia looking at both oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And you'll find American officials and think tankers starting to talk more and more now, not about the Asia-Pacific, but about the Indo-Pacific. And what we mean when we say this is we are picturing an Asia where the lines between, the old traditional lines between South Asia and East Asia are now blurred. And we need to see Asia as a whole. We recommended that Washington invite or work with the other APEC members. The ASEAN, or APEC is, of course, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. We recommended that the United States work with other members of APEC to invite India to join APEC. The reason we did this was that American trade policy and economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific right now is primarily a trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. And while our strategic footprint and strategy lies from India through the Pacific, our trade strategy actually cuts India out of that picture. It also cuts 3 of the ASEAN countries out of the picture, because Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are not members of APEC, and therefore India, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar are not eligible to be part of our trade engagement in Asia. This does not make sense from a CSIS point of view. So we recommended to the United States to invite India to join APEC. We've also recommended that the United States enter into a free trade agreement with ASEAN. And the reason for that is that the criteria to be part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, RCEP, which is the economic engagement or economic integration plan under the EAS. It includes everybody right now, all of the EAS members, which of course I know all of you know the East Asia Summit includes the 10 ASEAN countries, plus Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, India, and the Americans and the Russians. But the RCEP includes all of the East Asia Summit members, except for those who don't have an FTA with ASEAN. So the Russians and the Americans are outliers on the economic engagement. I very much believe, and so do my fellow authors of the study, which included Ambassador Hemant Singh, Raja Mohan, Ted Osius, who was a political officer here and was on loan from the State Department, and Rick Inderfirth, who was a former Assistant Secretary of South Asia, that we must lead with economic engagement in Asia. You can't lead with security. Security follows economic engagement, and our security ties are very important. But economic engagement is a fundamental and necessary part of a long-term and sustainable security engagement. So we've made these recommendations, including 40 other recommendations. There's 42 recommendations in this report, and I wouldn't dare to outline all of those for you today. But I would love to, I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I'd love to understand what you think about India's engagement in Asia, and what you think the Americans can do to be a better partner, not only to India, but to other countries in the EAS. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.